Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we'll be continuing our study of Machiavelli's Prince. And in a moment, we'll get to chapters 4, 5, and 6. But first, a little recap of what we've seen before. In the dedicatory letter, we saw that Machiavelli's topic in The Prince will be the actions of great men, that this is the subject that he cares about the most and has devoted his life to studying both theoretically and practically through personal experience in politics. He's going to distill all of his wisdom, which he has gained through sometimes dangerous activities himself, and encapsulate it in this book. We also see that Machiavelli, of course, is not just theoretically interested in what greatness is, but that he aspires towards greatness himself, that he is leaving instructions for this book to be published after his death, and that clearly his own path to greatness has to do with this book and the influence that it's going to have on the world. In the opening chapters, we see that Machiavelli will define greatness in terms of acquisition. This is because, as he tells us in chapter 3, acquisition is definitive of human nature. Human beings by nature desire to acquire, and the only thing that we really care about by nature is to succeed at acquiring what we desire. Implying here that morality does not really come into it at bottom. Morality is something that Machiavelli will treat as a superficial phenomenon, something that matters only in very limited ways that can be manipulated, but that at heart nobody really cares about. So if human nature is acquisition and we measure by success, then greatness will be maximizing our success at acquisition, being the most successful. And this is what Machiavelli will call virtue. He introduces that term in chapter 1, and he'll use it throughout the book. Virtue in general means excellence or perfection, synonymous with greatness, but Machiavelli will be using it strictly to refer to those qualities, those skills, those abilities, those tendencies that allow us to acquire more effectively. So what is the art of acquisition? The art of acquisition we see has to do with understanding not only one's own motivations, what one is trying to achieve, but also understanding other people. So for example, Machiavelli says if you want to add to your territories, and you look at the territory you want to add, it's currently being ruled by somebody else. So obviously that person is going to oppose you. Who's going to help you? You need somebody to help you. You can't do it alone. And so you look for people who are disgruntled. And he says, human nature being what it is, people are always envious and disgruntled with the existing ruler. So it's easy to find somebody who will help you to take over. The hard part comes later, because precisely for the same reason these people envied the previous ruler, they're going to envy you. They didn't help you because they want to help you. They helped you because they wanted something for themselves. And he says you'll never be able to satisfy them because their desires are similar to yours. So they're competitors, basically. You both want the same thing. Therefore, you can't satisfy them without losing what you want. So the logic of this, which he points to the Romans as having exhibited this, very skillfully anticipating that anybody else who was at all powerful would eventually become a rival. And so they masterfully orchestrated things so they always would put down their rivals earlier than later. They always had a justification or excuse for doing it. And they always used the envy of others. So whoever was a rival to them, they would find some other country that was small and weak and not really a threat to them, and they would say, oh, this poor small country is being picked on by this other country. We'll go invade that country and set them straight. That was their way of eliminating their rivals while making it appear that they were doing this for others. That's going to be a very important formula in this book that he'll be expanding on quite a bit. But the point here is that when we think about how would we apply the wisdom of the Romans now, meaning in the 1500s when he's writing, there's a problem. And we see this problem in chapter 3, that not only is morality itself an obstacle to acquisition in the sense that Acquisition requires betraying others before they betray you. In other words, immoral acts, hurting people that haven't hurt you yet. You predict that they will, but they haven't done so. So you have to be willing to be immoral. Of course, you have to make it look moral. He's already implying that, right? But it's not, and he's making that part very obvious here at the beginning, that if there's any morality, it will be only the pretense of morality. But in his example in chapter 3 of King Louis of France invading Italy, it turns out that the friend that Louis had to betray was the Pope. And this is a significant problem because the Pope is not just another prince who has certain armies and territories. The Pope is the head of the church who has spiritual authority throughout Europe, including France. And so even in his own kingdom, Louis is sharing power with the Pope in the very significant sense that his own people believe that the Pope has authority over them, as well as Louis having authority over them. And he gives examples of that. So this is a problem that Machiavelli is raising because any prince in Europe of his day will have that exact same problem, which is that they're sharing power with the Pope. And therefore, any maneuverings they're doing, they're always going to have somebody which, from Machiavelli's point of view, is a rival, right? Somebody else who has power and who wants more power is a rival. And the only thing you can do with rivals is eliminate them. But how could you eliminate the Pope? Because that would be an act that would be considered profoundly immoral. How are you going to justify that? I mean, his formula is you have to be able to justify your immoral acts, but how could you justify going against the church and the head of the church? So these are the opening lessons and the opening puzzles and problems that Machiavelli starts his book with. And chapters 4, 5, and 6 are going to get us several steps further into how he's going to deal with those problems. So chapter 4 is titled, Why the Kingdom of Darius, which Alexander seized, did not rebel from his successors after Alexander's death. So one thing I want to note before we plunge into this is note the parallel here between the book Machiavelli is writing, published after his death, and the question that he's asking in chapter 4. Why was it that when Alexander conquered this particular territory, this particular kingdom, then he died, that his successors, those who came after him and represented an extension of his power, were able to hold on to it? So that question is clearly related to Machiavelli's own interests as an author here. How do you exert power after you're dead? That's a very important question for him, since he's certainly not going to be exerting power during his own lifetime, but he clearly desires to have some power. So while this is not a history lesson, Machiavelli is going to be talking about a number of historical figures. We want to have at least a rough sense of who they are to be able to understand the points that he's making here. So by Alexander, he's referring to Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian king in the 300s BC, who conquered a lot of the East and built a great empire. And among those he conquered was Darius, the Persian emperor, a great emperor whose empire Alexander took over. And as Machiavelli says, it was remarkable that having done so and then dying, Alexander was still able, through his successors, to maintain control over this empire that he had seized so recently. So how was that accomplished? So Machiavelli makes an important distinction here. He says, principalities of which memory remains have been governed in two diverse modes, either by one prince and all the others servants, who as ministers help govern the kingdom by his favor and appointment, or by a prince and by barons who hold that rank not by favor of the Lord, but by antiquity of bloodline. Such barons have their own states and subjects, who recognize them as lords and hold them in natural affection. Now, why is this an important distinction? First of all, as Machiavelli will make clear, in the East, in the Persian Empire, in the Turkish Empire of Machiavelli's time, and these other Eastern empires, they operate according to the first model, which is that the emperor, whoever is in charge of this empire, has all the power. Anybody under him who is wielding power does so only as a servant. Nobody thinks that any of the ministers of state themselves have any authority. They only get their authority from the emperor, from the king, from the prince, as he calls him, right? The prince, the ruler. But it's in Europe, in France, and in other European kingdoms, principalities, that the second model applies. This is what we call the feudal system. That is, the king may be at the top of the pack, but under him are barons, other nobles, earls, dukes, etc. And they all have their own titles to authority independently of the king. Now, yes, they're under the king, but they don't get their authority from the king. As Machiavelli says here, they get it from their bloodline, and people regard them as having power, and people have a certain respect and affection towards it. He doesn't mean this, of course, in a Hallmark card kind of way, but people naturally regard them as princes or rulers. So this is the condition in Europe, and we want to keep that in mind. That Alexander was dealing with the first model, but anybody who's reading Machiavelli's book and trying to apply it is going to be dealing with the second model. So that's a major part of this chapter, is just telling us we're not dealing with the same situation that Alexander was dealing with. We could admire him and what he did, but we're dealing with a different set of problems. But there was somebody who dealt with similar problems to what Machiavelli is, and once again, it's the Romans. So for the second time, Machiavelli is going to look to the Romans for wisdom, but for the second time, it's going to be a question, how could we apply this today? Because we don't seem to be quite capable of doing what they did. But what did they do? He talks about how when the Romans were conquering Spain, France, and Greece, in other words, they were conquering in Europe, in where this feudal system came from and currently exists in Machiavelli's time, and they had difficulties of the kind that Machiavelli, is going to say come from this. Because of the independent authority of these smaller princes, it makes it harder for one prince to really get all the power. So as long as the memory of these different principalities lasted, the Romans were always uncertain of their possession. But when their memory was eliminated with the power and long duration of the empire, the Romans became secure possessors of them. So it's the same logic we saw in chapter 3 of eliminating rivals, but now Machiavelli is applying it to a sort of a bigger scale. So it's not just individuals that you are working with that you have to betray, but you have to look at all sources of power within society. And remember, in chapter 3, he mentioned the church as being one of those, so we want to keep that in mind. He's not mentioning the church here, but he's thinking about it, and he's asked us to think about it already. Any independent power source is a problem. And so the Romans had to deal with this, and it took time. There wasn't a quick solution, but what they had to do was eliminate those independent power sources, and then they had to keep them gone. They had to keep them suppressed or missing for a long period of time, and then people eventually forgot about them. So there will have to be a ruthless suppression, just like he had said. If you're eliminating a prince, you have to eliminate his bloodline, which might mean killing a bunch of babies, right? But here he's saying even much bigger. You have to eliminate not just an individual and his bloodline. You have to eliminate whole systems, like feudal system, whole systems of nobility that the people regard as being innately authoritative or powerful, and you have to clear them out and keep them out long enough for people to just get over that. So chapter 5 teaches us actually a very similar lesson applied to a somewhat different example of the same kind of problem. The title is, the chapter is entitled, How Cities or Principalities Which Lived by Their Own Laws Before They Were Occupied Should Be Administered. So in a sense, it's almost the opposite of the previous chapter. It's when you're dealing with republics, when you're dealing with peoples who are used to governing themselves. And this is something that the Romans also dealt with, and he will, for the third time, he will look to the Romans as an example of what you need to do. The Romans, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, destroyed them and did not lose them. So this is going to be the same logic again. You have to eliminate rivals. In this case, the idea of the freedom of the people, that the people get to govern themselves if you're trying to govern them, that whole concept of self-governance is a rival to you. And how do you get rid of that? Well, the whole people has that, right? So he starts using a term like destroy applied to the entire society. You have to tear that society down to the point where there's nothing left of their old ways and customs. So the Romans wanted to hold Greece much as the Spartans had held it by making it free and leaving it its own laws, but they did not succeed. So they were compelled to destroy many cities in that province so as to hold it. For in truth, there is no secure mode to possess them, that is, free peoples, other than to ruin them. So we've taken the same logic of individuals you have to betray. Then he applies that to the aristocracy. You would have to eliminate an entire aristocracy that is in your way. And now he brings it all the way to a republic, the people as a whole. If they are used to governing themselves, you have to wreak destruction in that regions to completely disabuse them of the idea that they'll be able to govern themselves. And he hammers this point in by adding, whoever becomes patron of a city accustomed to living free and does not destroy it should expect to be destroyed by it. For it always has a refuge in rebellion, the name of liberty, and its own ancient orders, which are never forgotten either through length of time or because of benefits received. So what happens to the idea that Machiavelli is a Republican, that he's really trying to promote Republican government? As we'll see, there is going to be a very significant interest that Machiavelli has in the people and in satisfying the people and, in fact, founding on the people. So even within the prince, we'll see that there is ultimately a certain Republican slant to his vision for government. But here, he makes it abundantly clear that there's nothing sentimental or romantic about this. And in particular, if you're establishing your own power, in other words, if you're imposing a new order, you have to eliminate the old. And again, this is something that applies to individuals, it applies to classes, noble classes, and it applies also to entire societies and their ways of life. So even though he didn't mention the church here and religion, we can see that Machiavelli is relentless in the logic that he introduced in chapter 3, which he extends into chapters 4 and 5. And it is abundantly clear that if here when he's talking about the ancient orders, one of those ancient orders that is in the way in Machiavelli's own time is the church. So what does he want to do? He's making the point indirectly in these chapters, just as you have to destroy nobilities and you have to destroy republics to assert your own power. You're going to have to do something similar to that about the church. And chapter 6 is where we're going to get not the way of doing that per se. We're going to get the greatest examples, actually the greatest examples of all time. And we're going to see how that relates to this question of religion, so that we're going to get a more precise sense of exactly what Machiavelli is going to recommend as a goal to aim at, which he's going to spend more time looking at the methods of achieving that goal later in the book. So we get to chapter 6, which in many ways is the most important chapter of the book. You notice in the title of new principalities that are acquired through one's own arms and virtue. This is the ideal for Machiavelli. Virtue is greatness, it's perfection. And the greatest men, he's going to say, in history are those who exhibited, the most virtue. And they did so by building up their, not only achieving more power than anybody else has achieved, but they started from nothing. Now, why is that? This gap between where they started with nothing and how they ended up with more than anybody else in history is not an accident for Machiavelli. Because as we've seen, his logic has already been, even if you're starting halfway, you have to, hit the reset button. You have to knock out, what came before, because what came before is not going to be to your advantage if you're trying to assert yourself. So the newness and the so you could say creativity of this is a whole part of the greatness for Machiavelli. You're trying to actually impose your own order on things. You have to eliminate the old order. So it's not coincidental that those who started with nothing, which as we're going to see, it means that they started with catastrophe. They started with some kind of chaotic circumstances, which they were able to stamp their own solution onto that. And that's why it was so long lasting. So he introduces this: no one should marvel if, in speaking as I will do of principalities are altogether new, both in prince and in state, I bring up the greatest examples. A prudent man should always enter upon the paths beaten by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent, so that if his own virtue does not reach that far, at least it is at least in the odor of it. So he makes it abundantly clear that he's raising these examples for us to imitate, and we should not forget that, because they are, great historical figures. We can look at their legendary figures, but he's not bringing them up for entertainment or for, just contemplation. He's bringing them up for imitation. So we want to look at them very pragmatically. What did they do? How did they do it? And how could we do the same thing now? This, in other words, is where Machiavelli is really giving us the agenda of his book, which is why I said it's one of the most important chapters, because he's really coming out here and showing us what his purpose in writing this book is all about. So who are these men? First, we got to start by, seeing who they are, get a sense of what they did, and then see how Machiavelli is going to analyze that, what lessons he's going to draw from them. To come to those who have become princes by their own virtue and not by fortune. Notice the contrast again. Virtue is the opposite of fortune. Virtue is your own skill and control over circumstances to succeed at acquiring what you desire, as opposed to relying upon chance. I say that the most excellent are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and the like. So there's others, but he picks four for us to look at. So I'm going to skip Moses for a minute. We're going to have a lot more to say about Moses. What is he doing on this list? How does he fit? How does he not fit? But let's start with the others and just get a quick sense of who they are. So first of all, we have Cyrus. Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Persian Empire. And he's not only an historical figure, but he is the subject of many legendary tales and myths, which is an important fact that we'll want to keep in mind as we look at the people on this list. Romulus was the founder, of course, of the Roman Empire, and he also is a subject of many mythological tales, including that he was raised by wolves, and that instead of dying, he actually ascended into heaven and became a god. And finally, we have Theseus, who was the founder of what later became the Athenian Empire, and who also is a subject of many myths and legends, including that he slew this monster, the Minotaur, and this was part of the heroism with which he was able to found the society that went on to become a great ancient empire. So this raises an interesting question about Machiavelli's list. What is Moses doing on this list? Now, in a certain sense, it's pretty clear that these were founders of empires. Moses was the founder of what became the Kingdom of Israel. And these were legendary figures. And of course, there's all kinds of stories about how Moses was, rescued by being put in a basket in the Nile River, how he went through all these adventures and eventually led the Israelites out of Egypt where they were enslaved and so forth. So there's a lot of similarities, but there's one major problem with Machiavelli putting Moses in the same list as Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. And he mentions that problem here. He says, although one should not reason about Moses, as he was a mere executor of things that had been ordered for him by God, nonetheless, he should be admired, if only for that grace which made him deserving of speaking with God. Now, this is an interesting objection. First of all, it's very interesting that Machiavelli would raise an objection. We'll notice that throughout his book, he really doesn't entertain objections. He just tells us the way things are. So this is a very exceptional thing for him to say, looks like I made a mistake here. Also, Machiavelli could have edited the text if he thought there was a mistake. So clearly that it isn't a mistake. It's something that he wants us to think about. And now look at the way he talks about the relationship between reason and grace here. Reason, of course, is thinking about the nature of things, as Machiavelli is doing in this book. And grace means the supernatural aid that God gives us, guidance and assistance that God gives us to accomplish things. Now, if you look at Machiavelli's own way of thinking, right? Virtue is relying on yourself. Virtue is relying on your own powers. And grace is relying upon God. So we can see that for Machiavelli, there's a problem. There's a conflict between virtue and grace. Virtue is self-reliance. Grace is reliance on somebody else, namely God. Now, in classical thought, which we're going to look at later, there's an expression that grace does not destroy nature, grace perfects nature. And we'll dig into that, and we'll see that's the milieu in which Machiavelli is writing, is that the theologians would say grace perfects nature. But with this objection, Machiavelli is subtly indicating his rejection of that theology, because he says, actually, maybe I shouldn't put Moses here because he had grace, and that's something completely different from what I'm talking about. So when he's talking about nature, and he thinks nature is not perfected by grace, there's an opposition between nature and grace. And we're going to see that as his analysis continues, that in fact Machiavelli rejects notions of God and grace. And then where's he going to go with that? What does he really think about Moses? Why did he put him on the list? And what is he really going to argue in this chapter? He goes on, let us consider Cyrus and the others who have acquired or founded kingdoms. You will find them all admirable. So notice he said Moses is admirable. And he said, but they're all admirable. So suddenly Moses is not so special anymore. He's still one of the greatest men in history, but there's other greatest men in history like him. And is he really any different from them? That's what Machiavelli is trying to get us to think about. He can't come out and say it. So this is one of the many things that Machiavelli is never going to come out and say. But when he starts hemming and hawing, you know that he's trying to say something that he can't say. So what is it? And if their particular actions and orders are considered, remember this is his topic in the book, the actions of great men. So if you just look at the actions, they will appear no different from those of Moses, who had so great a teacher. Think about this. Machiavelli is saying, what did Moses learn from God? Essentially saying nothing. He didn't learn anything that Cyrus didn't know, or Romulus didn't know, or Theseus didn't know. And how do I know that? Because look at their actions. Their actions were all the same. Now, this, all by itself, this is telling us a lot, because if you look at the accounts of Moses in Scripture, Moses is talking to God all the time. And like Machiavelli had said earlier, he was taking orders from God. He was doing God's plan, right? Well, now he says he didn't do anything different from these other guys. Does Machiavelli believe, did anybody reading Machiavelli's Prince believe that Cyrus was talking to God and took orders from God? Did anybody believe Romulus was really working for God, or Theseus? Now, the Romans believed that Romulus was a god. The Persians believed that Cyrus had been sent, he had been decreed by fate to be the ruler, and so forth, right? So the people within these empires believed that there was something divine or godlike about their great founder. But does Machiavelli's audience believe that about them? No. So what Machiavelli is suggesting here is there's really nothing different about Moses. In other words, everything that has to do with God in the story of Moses, he's suggesting is superfluous. It's legendary. It's fictional. It's something that either Moses himself made up or somebody later on made up to buttress, Moses's reputation. So as one examines their actions and lives, one does not see that they had anything else from fortune. And remember, fortune is chance, but Machiavelli, since he opposes it to virtue, your own arms, anything that you get from anybody else is fortune. And this would include grace. That's a major lesson that he's teaching in this chapter. So none of them, including Moses, had anything from fortune, meaning Moses was not really relying upon God in Machiavelli's view. All they had was the opportunity, by which he means there was a disaster, and they were able to solve that disaster, which gave them the matter enabling them to introduce any form they pleased, because things were so bad, and if they were the hero, then everybody was going to follow them. Without that opportunity, their virtue of spirit would have been eliminated, and without that virtue, the opportunity would have come in vain. So specifically, he says, it was necessary that Moses would find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians so that they would be disposed to follow him so as to get out of their servitude. So now he is coming out and saying as clearly as he possibly can that Moses was not working for God, right? Because it was necessary for him to find the people in trouble and to rescue them. He was following nature and necessity, which for Machiavelli is in opposition to the divine or God. Not in classical thought, as we'll see later. Such opportunities, therefore, made these men happy, and their excellent virtue enabled the opportunity to be recognized. Hence, their fatherlands were ennobled by it and became very happy. And we'll see more about this later, but I want to point out the use of the term happy is very significant here, because in classical thought, happiness is the goal of human existence. When we understand the nature of things and the order of things, we act in accordance with it, it brings about happiness. And Machiavelli is piggybacking on that, but he is, of course, radically disrupting the classical order of things. He's introducing a completely new understanding of the order of things, but he's also promising happiness. So he says these men, by achieving such greatness and power, became happy, but also their fatherlands were ennobled and became very happy. So there is a kind of common good in Machiavelli. It is not the classical common good. As we're going to see, in fact, Machiavelli denies the existence of good as an objective reality. What he's about is satisfaction of desires. So his common good is going to be something like a collective satisfaction of desires. But here he says that when a great man becomes powerful and establishes an empire, there is sort of a trickle-down effect, if you will, on the people as a whole. That the fatherlands are enjoying the benefits of this empire, and they become happy that way. So that is a very important point that we want to consider as we go through the book here. So here we get to the conclusion of the chapter, and Machiavelli comes as close to the point as he can here without being a little too explicit. He says, it is, however, necessary, if one wants to discuss this aspect well, to examine whether these innovators, those introducing new modes and orders, as he puts it, stand by themselves or depend on others. That is, whether to carry out their deed they must beg or indeed can use force. Now, it's important here to note that in the Italian, the word beg and the word pray are the same word, just like they were in older forms of English. So you could translate this as, if you need to pray, or do you use force? Do you use your own means to achieve your ends? From this it arises that all the armed prophets conquered, and the unarmed ones were ruined. For besides the things that have been said, the nature of peoples is variable, and it is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. And thus things must be ordered in such a mode that when they no longer believe, one can make them believe by force. So Machiavelli raises that question, do you need to pray or do you use force? And he answers it saying, if you want to succeed, you'll have to use force, not prayer. So this is the ultimate expression of his sense of virtue, is that the virtuous man cannot depend upon God. The virtuous man cannot depend upon anything or anyone outside of his own force and ingenuity. Because if you look at this, you can see that, first of all, Machiavelli is calling all of these men prophets, Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. So he has, again, obliterated the difference between Moses and the other ones. There's not, in other words, he's not looking at Judaism or Christianity as being any different from any kind of mythology or belief system that's out there. They're all imaginary, as he's going to put it later in chapter 15. They're all imaginary. So there's no fundamental difference. The difference is that if you want somebody to believe in your belief system, you have to make them believe it. You have to be an armed prophet. And all of these men were armed, right? They all did, in fact, use force. And this is something that Machiavelli would no doubt allude to. So just as a quick example of that, I'm not going to dig into it, but if you look at the story of the golden calf in Exodus 32, what happens when Moses is gone talking to God and he comes back and the people are worshiping the golden calf, they have rejected the belief system that Moses gave them. Now in Scripture it says, Moses was talking to God. God told them about this, and God said, I'm going to punish them. I'm going to wipe them all out. And Moses says, no, God, don't do that. Let me handle it. And Moses goes down, and here's what he does. Moses divides the people between those who repent and are sorry for what they did, the Levites, and those who do not repent and basically say, hey, what do you expect, you know? And Moses says to those on his side, he says, put every man his sword upon his thigh, go and return from gate to gate through the midst of the camp, and let every man kill his brother and friend and neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the words of Moses, and there were slain that day about 23,000 men. So this would be the kind of thing that Machiavelli would look at as evidence, you know, for his thesis, right? Of course, from a scriptural point of view, there's a very different lesson here. But for Machiavelli, he would give this as an example of it requires force to instill a belief system. So what do we learn from this? Very briefly, because we'll be unpacking this through the rest of the book, here's a couple things we learned from this. First of all, Machiavelli is aiming high in this book, as high as he knows how to aim. He thinks the greatest men are those who founded empires, but by an empire, he's talking about not only governmental, what we would call governmental power and state power, but also belief systems and religions. Not because he cares about those beliefs in themselves, but because he sees them as an essential part of founding an empire. That is, for an empire to work, it has to have a belief system. Why is that? Well, it goes back to the problem of what happens after you die. Because you can have a lot of power while you're alive, and then when you die, and we'll see examples of this later, then everybody says, oh, the tyrant's dead, and they just move on to something else, right? So Machiavelli is looking at how you can exert power after you're dead. And you can only do that through beliefs, right? Because only if people believe that either you're from God or there's some other belief they have that would make them want to follow you after you're dead. Also, happiness, right? They have to believe that they are experiencing happiness. They're getting a share of some kind of happiness that comes from the empire that you're founding, and being a part of it is going to bring them that kind of happiness. So to achieve what he wants to achieve, to the kind of greatness that he wants to achieve, religion or belief, you could say in a broader sense, belief systems, because I think when you look at the origins of modern ideologies, this is a very important template for that. Without necessarily being officially religious, there are many belief systems that have been propagated, and they are attempting to establish and perpetuate a certain order of things, a certain empire, a certain power structure in the world. And that is what Machiavelli is getting at in this chapter. But the final thing that I want to note is when he says that only the armed prophets succeed, and certainly, as I said, you can look at the story of Moses and the things that he did, and you can find examples of force. But what about the overwhelming question that Machiavelli does not mention in this chapter? After all, why is it that Machiavelli has a hard time talking about Moses? It's not because the kingdom of Israel is still there, or that he's living in the kingdom of Israel where you have to say good things about Moses. He can't speak freely about Moses because he's living in a Christian society. But who was the founder of Christianity? It wasn't Moses. It was a descendant of Moses, Jesus Christ. But Machiavelli does not mention Christ. And is there any way that you could refer to Christ as an armed prophet? That's ridiculous, right? So this, obviously Machiavelli is aware of this, and he does not mention it, at least not explicitly. So this is something going forward that we're going to have to bear in mind. The empire that Machiavelli is living in is the Christian empire, basically. And he is not happy with it. He thinks that it's an interference with the logic of power consolidation. In essence, he is trying to overthrow Christianity and set up a new belief system. And that's why he's so interested in the people who establish new belief systems in history. How did they do that? And he says they did it by force. But there's a glaring counterexample. Christ set up the very belief system that Machiavelli is not happy with, but is currently in force. And he did it without violence. So Machiavelli is well aware of that, and his own strategy, remember, he himself is not an armed prophet in any literal sense. He's just writing a book, right? So in a very strange kind of way, Machiavelli is going to be more like Christ, more like we might say the Antichrist, but he's going to himself be trying to achieve a certain kind of empire without directly using violence, but rather working directly on our beliefs and trying to induce us to believe something. But how is that going to be possible without physically forcing us to believe it? And again, this chapter is laying the groundwork for that, but we're going to see the details of how Machiavelli is going to try to do that in the upcoming chapters.